Yes, Mr. Maleka, you may proceed.
Mr. Fuzile, we were at page 26, and you're about to turn to the technical aspects of the proposed nuclear procurement with reference to the task teams as of 8 December 2015. You recall that?
Yes.
And we know the significance of that date of 8 December. What happened from the 8th of December 2015 with regards to the nuclear procurement?
We were advised, when I say we, the rest of the members of that technical team, that on the 8th, which I think was a Tuesday, yes, there was going to be a meeting of the CCC committee, which is a committee of cabinet that President Zuma chaired, which was considering or tasked with considering matters relating to nuclear and nuclear procurement, among other things. So we were then ready with a presentation that was combining this presentation that we went through, that annexure with some details.
Page 138 and something.
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
Yes. That presentation. That presentation was kind of, the one we have here was the Treasury's starting point, which, of course, elements of it were now supposed to be combined in a presentation that would have been a representative view of that technical task team. So the meeting was scheduled for, let's say, 2 in the afternoon of that day. And then when we were on our way there, we were told, no, the meeting has been rescheduled to commence an hour later than the original planned time. But of course, because we were already on our way, we continued. I'm referring to Mr. Mukhajane and Mr. Michael Sachs. When we got there, we realized that the president's residence, official residence in Pretoria, we realized that there were many cars parked outside, but that didn't really bother us. We continued to the holding room. What then struck us was that closer to the time of the start of the meeting, the people whose cars had been parked outside came out of one of the rooms, and it happened to be all of the relevant government people, officials and ministers who were part of the process of considering nuclear procurement in government, except us as Treasury.
Who were part of the committee that maybe for convenience can be called what, NIC or NEC or the NWEWC?
Yes.
Were they part of that committee?
Yes, they were part of that committee.
Okay.
So all the people, in other words, the members of the executive, who were members of that committee.
Yeah, ministers.
Ministers and their officials,
yes,
who were members of the technical team,
yeah,
that was doing the technical work,
yeah,
which was supposed to answer to the question of what it would cost and how it could be made affordable, paid for, and so on and so forth. All of them, but Treasury and Finance, or the Minister of Finance, were not part of that.
Did they emerge from
one of
a meeting or just one of the rooms? Whether there was a meeting or not,
no,
you don't know?
they came from a meeting.
There was a meeting?
There was a meeting.
Okay, okay. And do you know whether to discuss issues that were relevant to this committee or not?
I
don't know that part. Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
So we then the meeting commenced without, sort of sparing you some of the details, which don't add value to this. The meeting commenced, and So the Minister of Energy just introduced opposition the discussion, and the Director General and the DDG responsible for nuclear and energy, then they went through the details of the presentation.
Where was Minister Nene at the time?
Minister Nene had arrived, now we were all there.
Yeah, I seem to recall that before that meeting, in his evidence, he referred to a trip to Russia.
Yes, yes. Yes.
Did you know about his trip to Russia?
I did. I did. Minister Nene had gone to Russia, and upon returning, he did relate to me that when he was in Russia, there were some discussions involving him and the Minister of Energy. Some of the ministers were there, and at some point, President Zuma, where they discussed a need to write a letter to the President of Russia, which he didn't agree to. Yeah.
All right. He canvassed that part of his evidence. You
Yes,
don't have to
yes,
worry about it.
Yes.
What I'd like you to do, if you can, and
Yes.
subject to your level of comfort, just quickly take us through the proceedings of the meeting.
The meeting, okay.
Yes.
And before you do that, was President Zuma chairing that meeting on that day?
Yes, he was.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman.
all right.
President Zuma was chairing the meeting. The meeting commenced, and you'll tell me if I'm leaving things that I'm trying to
Yes.
summarize, but at the same time, without leaving important details out. So the presentation was done, and it will become evident as I talk through the differences between what was presented and what is contained here just now. And that is, I think, what is consequential more than the background to it. So when they finished presenting, the president turned to Mr. Nene and asked him if he had anything to say. And he said a few things, including the following, that he thinks that the estimates that were presented by the colleagues from Energy were a bit too optimistic. In other words, the estimated costs were a bit too optimistic. I guess he was remembering what he knew from the presentation that we had taken him through and preparing. But he then, because one of the things that was proposed was that maybe there should be a market sounding. In other words, there should be a testing of what those who could potentially supply nuclear would charge for it. And that was the way to test the market on it. So, and then he paused. And at that point, the president turned towards me, and I was on his right, and he said, asked if I had anything to say.
Before you get to that point, can you deal with one of the most important concerns Minister Nene had with regard to the pricing?
Yes, yes.
With reference to the exchange rate?
Yes, yes. In fact, Mr. Nene pointed out that insofar as what Energy had presented, which was that the weakest that the rand could be, in other words, the most expensive that nuclear could be when converted to rands from dollars, was an exchange rate of 10 rand to the dollar. He did highlight the discrepancy that we had run a few more modeling scenarios which assumed a weaker rand. And he pointed out that, in fact, on the day, the rand was probably 40% plus weaker than the weakest that the presentation had assumed. By the way, Mr. Chairman, needless to point out that it never strengthened to 10 rand.
Yes. So this was a dollar-based acquisition.
60% of it, by our estimates, was going to be denominated in dollars. So in other words, we would have been importing some of the stuff, and therefore we would need dollars to pay for it. So the exchange rate matters in that respect.
So your liabilities are denominated in dollar? and your payment obligations are denominated in a rand, which is weaker as against
Yes.
dollar.
Yes.
In paragraph 93.
Well, I'm not sure. Even on their presentation, didn't they factor in that they had to use the dollar-rand exchange rate, but they just got it too low?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
But they just assumed that the weakest it could be was 10 rand.
Yeah. So in other words, what I mean is you might use the rand,
Yes.
but provided you've got the exchange rate right, that should not be a problem.
I would say yes, there's no
Yes.
problem about it. But in
Yes.
a way,
No, it's a problem, Mr.
you can understate, because if you assume that the weakest that the rand can be, you are understating what the likely cost is going to be.
Yes. I
Yes.
think Mr. Malega wants to follow that
Yes,
up.
I mean, if you underestimate
Yes.
the exchange rate,
Yeah.
you are underpricing the
No, that's
acquisition.
true. I'm not disagreeing with that. If I sent the impression that I was disagreeing with it, in fact, I think I just said that if you just use the exchange rate on that day, you would have understated the cost of the program by about 40%.
Yes. In fact, I'd like you to deal with that issue with reference to the actual figures that Minister Nena put forth at the meeting.
Maybe, Mr. Malega, maybe it's my question that may have caused confusion. But it was following upon your question.
My apologies,
And
Chair.
understood you to be suggesting that what the people who made a presentation on behalf of the Department of Energy, that what was wrong that they did was to use the rand in terms of their estimate of costs.
Yes.
And I was suggesting to Mr. Fuzile that the use of the rand alone, if you have got the exchange rate against the dollar correct, should not on its own be a problem. Obviously, if you use the rand without
Yes.
the dollar, then it's a problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just confirm that the figures that Minister Nene put to the meeting and which were not disputed are the figures set out in page 34, paragraph 93?
Yes. No, they are.
They are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they are correct. Yeah. So that's why I was using, about 40%.
40%.
Yeah.
So that the Department of Energy's pricing was 40% understated
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
being at the rand dollar exchange of 14.57.
Yeah.
Well, you might not be able to say this, but I would have thought that people who were working on something so important and delicate wouldn't have got the exchange rate so wrong. Or am I being unfair to them?
Let me just say this, Chairman, to that. Having worked with budgets for many years, I do know that people know that when you want approval for something, you don't say it's very expensive.
Okay.
Because,
okay.
I mean, it's counterintuitive, because you want to say to people, we can afford it plus other things. You know what I'm saying? Once you have signed the contract, you have signed it. I mean, an example, and I hope I don't offend anyone by saying this, but it is the truth. When the Gauteng government wanted to procure the train, very beautiful thing, the estimated cost, the initial estimated cost, I think, was 7 billion or thereabout. But the ultimate cost of the thing was between 25 and 30 billion rand. That's the magnitude of, and it happens, I mean, having dealt with budgets, it is
It
so
happens
rare.
often.
It is so rare. The way it works is like this. If people want the project to be supported and they think that it might not be, they will understate the cost. When they know that the project has got such support that no one can say no to it, they will overstate it because they know that once the money is allocated, then they can move it to other things. So it's part of budget gaming. But it doesn't work well because it means that you're misleading, you're taking a decision on the assumption that something costs you 40% less than what it will actually cost.
Yeah, but it could be quite serious, isn't it? Because if you put the price low because you genuinely believe that's the price, it's one thing, and maybe we can talk about your understanding of the relevant issues, your competence and knowledge and experience and so on. But if you know what the true position is and you give a wrong one, you are misrepresenting, and that's not acceptable, isn't it? In other words, if you do it deliberately, knowing what the true position is, as opposed to you giving a position that you genuinely believe is correct, but it might be found to be incorrect.
No, that is very true. But the trick with this thing
You don't want to condemn them too much.
I still condemn them, but I still condemn them actually. But it can be argued that no, it was my projection, and I thought that the rand would strengthen. And what do I say to that? You can't say you should have thought that it will appreciate, it will depreciate. However, having said that, the strength of our own approach lies in the fact that in our case, we had gone back in history and looked and found, and we say this in the presentation, at how the rand behaves to the dollar over time. And what we found was that on average, over 2 decades or so, in fact, I think longer, the rand had weakened to the dollar by about 4% each year. So on the strength of that, at least you can say, but what then made you think that the rand would strengthen? And what do you say now that the rand hasn't strengthened? In fact, it has weakened in line with what the Treasury has said, kind of stuff. So you are right. It is hard. It would have been hard for them to motivate that their assumption is stronger than ours.
Yeah. Okay.
Let alone the fact that after time has moved, it has been confirmed that our modeling was superior to theirs.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, this is a very important point.
Yes.
Because you're going to hear a lot about that when Eskom comes in.
Yes.
With regard to the capital expenditure relating to Kusile and Medupi power plants. And you know that the justification about the 4-fold increase in the estimated initial capital expenditure is around the so-called cost overruns, but it raises a very fundamental point of project planning, project pricing, and project estimation.
Okay.
The second point that we would ask you to consider there is that we will lead evidence of Ms. Catherine McLeod, who would give you the actual figures of the annualized performance of the rand the year before Nenegate, and the annualized performance of the rand as against the dollar a year later, to give you a sense of the figures. But on this score, Mr. Fuzile, and that's the issue that I'd like you to comment on, because I'm afraid I don't accept your explanation. And it is this. The estimation provided by the Department of Energy at the time about the value of the rand as against the dollar, which was understated by 40%, could not have given rise to prudent fiscal pricing, because when you estimate the performance of a currency in relation to a foreign-based currency acquisition, you protect yourself as a buyer, and there are many instruments that you use in order to protect yourself volatility of your own currency. And we know there are a number of hedging instruments. So this could not have been a reasonable estimate against which the country could not have protected itself, given the far big difference between the actual rand performance at the time and their estimate at the time.
Yes. Look, I can't disagree with you at all. If I created the impression that I disagree with that, then I take that back. Bear in mind, which is the most powerful point about this, on the day, the rand was trading at the numbers you see.
Yes.
Right? So it's one thing to project forward and say it can be as weak as 20 rand to the dollar.
Yes.
On the specific day, which is why the thing was, it didn't make sense, let me just say, at all. But of course, you can spend the whole day, you can spend weeks, and someone can just say, I am assuming that it will strengthen. What do you say?
Well, you see, the reason why Mr. Maleka, says this is quite important
Yes.
is the context in which it comes before the Commission.
Yes.
We're looking to see whether anybody was actually making a contribution that could facilitate something that's wrong.
No, I understand.
And you see, you make the point that somebody could say, but I made assumptions, certain assumptions. You see, there would be a line where you say, in the light of so-and-so's knowledge and experience in these matters, on these issues, if he gives an estimate like X, and I think it's Y, I can accept that he might be making an honest error, okay? But you come to a stage where you say, if the same person gives Z as an estimate, knowing what he knows, what his training is, what his experience is, it can't be an honest error.
No, that's
so we may be looking for those kinds of things.
Yes.
In fact,
Yeah.
Chairman, if I may, let me perhaps try and help you. I do refer in the statement earlier on that part of what troubled us, all of us, and in my intervention in that meeting, this comes out, was the fact that we had discussed these things with the colleagues from Energy.
Yes.
And we pointed out these risks, for instance, this logic of how to project the exchange rate. No one knows, but you can estimate it. You can use the historical patterns to say more or less, if ABC obtains, the exchange rate will be there in future. Hence the reference to the fact that historically, our own currency has weakened against the dollar by about 4% each year. And we argued these things out. They appear to have accepted our logic, which is part of our contention.
Yes.
And it was part of my contention in my
Yes.
intervention.
Yes.
Right? They accepted the soundness of our logic. Then come the eighth.
Yes.
Then all of a sudden they go to the 10 rand.
And they don't counter the arguments that they knew you had raised about projections.
It was worse than that. Their option, they presented it as though we had agreed to it.
And
that I found objectionable. I mean,
and I would have imagined that having had a situation where you had engaged with them on these issues, and they seemed not to have any problem with the soundness of your arguments, you might have expected that if they were to present something different, they would come back to you first and say, you know what, we had this meeting and we thought you were right, but we have changed our mind because of ABCD.
No, precisely.
That's what you would have expected.
No, that's what, under normal circumstances.
Under normal
so
circumstances,
so that I'm clear,
Yes.
we found it objectionable,
Yeah.
and that was part of my, intervention. Because
Yeah.
to say, look, what has been presented is not what we agreed to. I couldn't, with a clean conscience, sit there, and you can see our own presentation, which is what I've taken you back to show you how we try to, and we water it down. We still say more work would need to be done to get to a closer approximation of what nuclear would cost. But it is definitely not what is predicated on an exchange rate of 10 rand to the dollar. Needless to say, the rand never got anywhere close to that years later. In fact, about a decade later, am I working the numbers right? Over a decade later.
Just under a decade. Was it 2015 or thereabout?
It was 2015, yeah.
I
don't know why I can't count now. But anyway,
It's much
yes,
less.
maybe it's safer to say years later.
Yes. Yeah, you summarize all of that in your intervention, including your observation of 40% in paragraph 98. And that takes me to paragraph 101 on page 36. And I leave that for you to explain in your own words, because a further procurement matter has been raised with you. Right. Can you just take us through what you say there?
Yes, as I say on 101, the President looked towards me and said,
before you say that,
Yes.
just indicate that you are now in a certain meeting.
no, it's the same meeting.
Or is it the same meeting?
It is the same
I thought
meeting.
it was, okay.
It is the same meeting,
Oh,
and
okay.
now
All right.
I've registered this objection.
Your objections, yeah.
And I've indicated that what we had discussed and thought we had agreed with the colleagues at Energy was the option of phasing nuclear rather than, take the modular approach, 2.4 gigawatts,
Yes.
contract for it,
Yes.
rather than 9.6, which we had, from our modeling, come to the conclusion it would be unaffordable.
Yes.
And then I ended by indicating that whilst the colleagues from Energy hadn't enthusiastically accepted what we were telling them, but we thought we were at one, that look, the phased approach would be the most sensible option. And then, of course, I closed my own intervention. And then the President raised the issue that the former Minister of Finance and I had stopped the Engine Petro SA project, just out of the blue, like that. And then made the comment.
I think you have got that in quotations in your
Yes.
statement. I think you must put it
Yes,
the
yes,
way he
yes.
put it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
At that point, I'm saying the President turned towards me and said that, and I quote, you and your former minister had stopped the Engine Petro SA project, unquote.
Who is the former minister you refer to?
It was Minister Goddard.
All right.
Remember, by that time, he had been shuffled to local government and provincial affairs, and Nene was the minister.
Yes.
Before he got shuffled back later on.
Yes.
A few days from that time. Then he...
This is still on the 8th of
This is still
December
on the 8th,
2015.
Mr. Chairman. This is still
before
on
9/12/2015. Okay.
Yes, it's just hours.
All right. Okay.
Before that. Then he said, then again, I quote him, he said, in other countries of the world, finance ministers don't tell the president that there is no money. Their job is to find the money, so that what has been decided can be implemented. But alas, this was not the approach of ministers in South Africa, unquote. I don't want to put an interpretation to that, but it did shock me. And I leave it to everyone with the background that I've painted to make out what it means.
Yeah. Before we get to the next topic, you make a big jump because in the next topic you talk about events after the removal of Minister Nene. And the chairperson has reminded you that after the 8th there was a momentous cabinet meeting of the 9th of December, which was the Wednesday following the previous Tuesday of the discussions you have dealt with. And you...
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Maleka. Can we conclude this meeting of the 8th in a way that makes it clear what happened? You made your presentation where you raised your objections towards the recommendations and approach taken by the team from the Department of Energy. And then you say at paragraph 101, the former president then turned towards you and commented, you and your former minister had stopped the Engine Petro SA project, close quotes. And then what comes after that, and you say you were shocked, and the meeting resolved to take the recommendations of the 9.6 gigawatts as presented by the Department of Energy to Cabinet the following day. Am I correct to take it that the conclusion of that meeting was effectively to reject or not to follow what Treasury was recommending should happen? In other words, to just take the recommendations to which Treasury had a lot of objections, take those to Cabinet for purposes of possible approval. Is that a fair understanding of how the meeting was concluded?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right. Then the next day you have cabinet meeting, and I understood from your previous evidence that you attended that meeting.
Yes, only for the part that related to, excuse me for laughing, but essentially I was there for the part that related to our business as Treasury, which was the approval of the national allocation.
Yes.
But I think that people knew I was there. So the item on nuclear was before that. And as we were sitting in the waiting room, because we never knew when we would be called or our turn would come, I just went around the corner to the giants. And when I returned, they said, no, you are needed inside. I said, so quickly, is it our turn? Because we had the agenda. Yes. They said, no, you are needed for the nuclear discussion. I hardly sat, and the matter had been decided. So, yeah.
So you ended up not making any contribution?
No, nothing. In fact, I just walked in and then out, and then back for our item.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, and we know that later in the late evening of that day, the President announced the release from office of Minister Nene and the appointment of Mr. Van Rooyen as the new minister. You have talked a lot about what happened immediately after the announcement was made. I'm not going to ask you to rehash what you said unless you find reason to do so. What I'd like to do is to take you back to the events you described after the removal of Minister Nene, as you discuss them from paragraph 103 on page 36. Are you there? All right. You referred to the Chief Procurement Officer. At that time, I believe it was Mr. Brown Yes. What did he have to do with this issue of nuclear? So much so that you refer to him and his office.
One of the things that I did, which may not be quite apparent here, is that I set up a team of DDGs led by Mr. Mukhajan, but supported by Michael Sachs, but in the main, but then also the Chief Procurement Officer and Mr. Donaldson. And I just said the four of them, and to the extent necessary, they could bring in anyone from the department with expertise that they thought they needed. But they should just look at all the technical aspects of this thing. And the relevance of the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer was in relation to, this is a procurement issue, decidedly. So, was to just test along the way the alignment or otherwise between the approach proposed or contemplated in relation to procuring nuclear to the rules, laws, and all such things that are relevant. For an example, I've referred earlier on in the statement and even in this testimony here that, to the fact that there was a two-stage approach contemplated. Yes. And that stuff, the Chief Procurement Officer was supposed to assist with looking at, and indeed he did get, what do you call this thing now? Legal opinion, pardon me, on this thing, and I think even two of them, which sort of indicated that the approach that was contemplated was not consistent with the law.
Yes. So the relevance of the Chief Procurement Officer was to ensure that there had to be a legally compliant procurement, yes, in relation to the nuclear.
That's the short of it, yes.
Proposed project.
Yes.
And then you say that there were continuing engagements between the Treasury team led by Mr. Mohajani and the Department of Energy team, and that ultimately led to a request for proposal that you say in paragraph 107 of your statement on page 38. Are you there?
Yes.
What happened thereafter once this idea of a request for proposal was put up?
Look, some of the engagements then kind of tapered off, so to speak. But of course, this may be the phase around which several of the agreements with the different countries were signed. With Russia, China, France. I will stop there. I think about 6 countries.
Eskom became involved.
Yes.
Do you remember?
Yes, there was a switch because at one stage there was the contemplation, as I indicated earlier on, that this would be done by NEXA, and I can say almost out of the blue, and there were changes at Eskom, at board level, at CO level, and all of a sudden, in my view, Eskom then came back and said, look, they can do nuclear. They think it's possible, they think it makes sense, and they were back looking at the possibilities of that.
Yeah. In paragraph 108, you indicate the extent to which Eskom became involved.
Yes.
Can you just highlight the key aspects and how Eskom became involved?
Yes. Around November, Cabinet approved that Eskom would be the owner, the operator, and procurer of nuclear. And around that time, then Eskom indicated that it was intending to issue an RFP for nuclear. What then stalled that was the fact that Earthlife then challenged, because the procurement process had been following this two-stage approach that I talked about, which is the selection of countries and signing agreements with them, and then having those countries inside that lot competing among themselves. In other words, the RFP now would go to them. So that was the stage. And then Earthlife Africa, sorry, I didn't say the name fully, took those agreements to court on the grounds that they were unlawful, unconstitutional, and so on. And I think that there is even a court process that unfolded in relation to that.
Yes. Chair, that's a matter of public record in the judgment of the Cape High Court. I doubt if there's anything that arises from it at this stage.
No, that's fine, yeah.
Mr. Fuzile, I mean, you draw some conclusions beginning from page 109, page 39, paragraph 109.1, about your experience relating to this proposed nuclear deal until it became ill-fated in the court process. You can, for the sake of those who don't have your statement yet, you can just pick up the highlights of the conclusions that you draw.
I can summarize that. I mean, the first point one makes in relation to this is something I hinted at earlier on, which was that this was the biggest procurement ever in the history of the country. Yet the processes were rushed, and some of the stuff that we've talked about, one hopes illustrates that. And it is my humble opinion that if nuclear had proceeded as it had been conceived of, in other words, 9.6 gigawatts of nuclear had been signed up for, given what we were projecting then and what we know now, we think that actually this country would have been in trouble. I mean, I say that with humility, but I believe it sincerely. Second, the process that was followed was seriously flawed. As we just indicate, for instance, a technical, cabinet dutifully asks, and rightly so, that there must be a process that determines the cost of nuclear, determines how we would pay for it, and determines if we can afford it. And then when we get to answering the question, the process gets so, I don't have a better word, but manipulated to end up with 9.6, because 9.6 is made to look 40% cheaper than it's likely to cost. And there is a brushing aside of what is the likely true cost of the program. That's.
Is it not more surprising that the same cabinet, which had said this is what must be done, then seems to approve when something else is done as well? In other words, as I understand it, the cabinet had said Treasury must, be part of looking at how much this would cost and how the country would pay for it. And then what was brought before the cabinet, as I understand from your evidence, was not giving answers to the questions that cabinet had raised. Namely, this is what must be looked into by Treasury, and yet cabinet was approving nevertheless. Or have I misunderstood something?
There's just a nuance, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Cabinet asked that there should be that process that you've described, which is described here.
Yes.
And in fairness to cabinet, when then that process is made to appear to produce an outcome that cabinet finds acceptable, then, how do I put this?
So you are suggesting that cabinet, when they approved what was placed before them, may not have been aware that what was placed before them didn't include Treasury's true position or Treasury's position. And because they thought it was an inclusive thing, they may have approved. They may have approved because they didn't know the true facts as to Treasury's position.
I think that is closer to the truth. Just take the fact that there is the prep meeting before the meeting in which we participated.
Yes.
And when we get to the meeting that we participated in, it puts now firmly on the table the recommendation of going with 9.6, and it assumes that the 9.6 will cost 40% less, right? As opposed to the 2.4 gigawatts phased procurement at a cost of, which is 40% higher. So by the time it goes to cabinet, the presentation I showed, which is the annexure here, I want to emphasize, is not the presentation cabinet saw.
Yes.
Although I was not in that meeting, my suspicion is that cabinet saw the same presentation that Mr. Nene and I objected to the previous day, which was saying the thing is going to cost cheaper, and it's affordable, and it has been discussed with all of us. And by the way, it was true that it was discussed with all of us on the 8th. What may not have been true is that we agreed to it, because I never agreed to it, and I can say that we never agreed to it from Treasury.
Well, I seem to recall that when he gave evidence before me, Mr. Nene, then that meeting of the 9th probably is the meeting where he says his attitude was, he had said everything that he needed to say. There was nothing further he could say that would help. So, which might suggest, and I can't remember his full evidence, which might suggest that he might not have had the chance or felt that it was going to serve any purpose to put his position or that of Treasury at the meeting of the 9th. You are not able to say anything about that.
No, I'm not able to say about that. But I can say the one thing I can say about it is the essence of this part of my submission is this notion of manipulation of process.
Yes.
No one has imposed that on me. I say it.
Yes.
So that it produces the outcome you want. So that it legitimizes a particular outcome.
Yes.
Which is not necessarily. So there was a sense now in which cabinet had asked a question, which was a very good question, which was a valid question, and cabinet thought it was getting. Let me rephrase that. It is not inconceivable that cabinet thought it was getting the answer that it asked for, yet it was half of it. So, it is a very, very important point, and one says these things. You asked me at the end of my testimony last time, what is the lesson from it? So obviously, one takes no joy in coming here and saying, these people did this and that. But the lesson is that, if people want the Treasury, sadly in this case, to tell on, because the Treasury, it is its job to work out whether a country can afford to pay for something. You may not like what it does. If you don't like it, if you think that the people who are running it are not of the caliber you want, I may live to regret this. It's better to remove them rather than pretend as if they have agreed with something that they have not agreed with. So it's not inconceivable that cabinet believed on the day that what was being presented was what Treasury and DOE had agreed to. And from a meeting that was chaired by no less than the president of the country. And then people can't ask and say, but we don't believe this. They've got no basis to do that.
But based on what you have told us, everyone who was at the meeting of the previous day
No,
of the 8th, knew exactly what the position was. They also knew that what was being presented to the cabinet on the 9th did not represent or did not include the views of Treasury.
without a shred of a doubt.
Yeah,
Without a shred of a doubt.
yeah. Thank you. And you say included in the meeting of the 8th were the former president and a number of ministers. And a number of ministers
Yes, yes.
and officials, some officials
Yes.
from, yeah. So there were quite a number of people in the executive who knew what the position
Yes.
was. But of course, those who had not attended that meeting might not have
Yes.
known.
Yes.
Okay.
No, in fairness to them.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
So, I mean, the other two conclusions I would make, Mr. Malek, I think we've exhausted the points, is that, I mean, I've hinted at the manipulation of process, but it's also the thing that is, I mean, government and governance, Chairman, requires, in one's experience, a careful blending of politics and technical processes. And if one dominates the other, then it produces suboptimal outcomes. And one says this with humility. I mean, many people who are ministers are not experts in their portfolios necessarily. That's why they've got battalions of people who are technical experts in that stuff. Of course, the technical experts don't have the political stroke executive authority and accountability to the electorate. So it is the careful bringing together of these two processes that is supposed to produce what you could call optimal outcomes. If one dominates the other, then you don't get the right out. That's the point that one makes towards the end of this. And of course, I do make the point in 109.4 that Mr. Nene got fired in that week. It may be a coincidence that it was after this disagreement with what happened on the meeting of the 8th. It may also be a coincidence that there was some unhappiness expressed about the budget, but it's a very strange coincidence.
Yes, Mr.
Right. The next topic that you deal with is the the engine petrol SA deal. We've heard a lot about it, and Minister Godin spent lots of time around it. And subject to the direction of the chairperson, I would ask you whether you confirm that what you say about it from page 110, go into page paragraph 114, explaining the deal structure, go into 114.5, explaining the parties to the transaction and all sorts of guarantees that were required to be put up, is correct.
Yes, it is correct, Mr. Malaga and Mr. Chairman.
All I wanted to do is to reflect on the conclusions that you yourself draw arising from that deal, because that is something unique to you, and it's not a matter of repetition of the evidence previously given by other witnesses on that deal.
I don't mind if he just looks at important features.
Yes.
Okay.
But if he could just give the context. We know that evidence has been given about this deal, but in one or two sentences it might be helpful to say this is what it was about,
Yes.
and then go to the important features and deal with them.
Can you do that, Mr. Fuzile?
As the Commission might be aware, I mean, Engen is owned by Petronas. Petro SA is a wholly state-owned, you can say,
Entity.
energy entity or entity in the energy space. there was a desire expressed to have Petro SA acquire 100%, in other words, buy totally, or controlling share, let me put it that way, sorry, controlling share in Engen, for a whole host of reasons that Minister Gordon, I think, ventilated here. Now, we expected that as part of the, call it logical stroke natural process of making that decision, there would be something that people in commerce call a due diligence, which entails, among other things, just assessing what it is that you are buying. When I was explaining this to some of the people in the department and they laughed at me, I said, you know, when there is a car parked there, shining paint, shining tires and stuff, and someone says to you, that car, it's 100,000. And you say to them, can I have the key so that I can just start it? They say, no, no, no. Come, let's sign the papers if you want the car. Don't ask about starting it now, checking if the gears engage and it moves. Would you buy it? So the due diligence about checking, you know, is there an engine? When you switch the key on, do the lights on the dashboard come on? When you turn the key on and start, does the car start? When you engage a gear, does it engage? Does it move forward, reverse? That kind of stuff. I mean, maybe the example is bad, but the due diligence about checking, you know, what is the worth of what you are buying?
Yeah.
What contracts does it have? And. So what was surprising about this deal is that there was a hurry to conclude it without a due diligence, which we found puzzling. And of course, we found that unacceptable, especially in a context where the price had increased almost every time, you know, without a convincing explanation as to why it was increasing, ultimately to the 18.6 billion, I think it is. That's reflected here. And of course, the other parties that were going to be involved in the deal, take, for instance, the party that's mentioned in one of the paragraphs Mr. Waleka was pointing to, Sanogol, 123.2, which was going to buy 49%. Right? At first, there was no written commitment from them that they would buy their 49%. When we insisted on it, it came with a condition that's subject to a due diligence. So we felt that it was a risky transaction because if someone agrees to participate to the extent of 49% into something they think it's worth 100 billion, and then when they actually do the due diligence, they think that it's half, they will not agree to put 49% of 100. They will say, no, 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 but this thing is not worth that because, and you are supposed to have done your own due diligence. You can't buy something you don't know what it's worth. So we felt that it was a very risky transaction. So in essence, and in the interest of time, I mean, the conclusion one makes on this is that it was again about this flawed process and this hurry to get to the end of a transaction where public monies are involved or the issuance of guarantees, which can in effect be called, which we thought was just totally inappropriate. I use a word here, perhaps a bit strong, but that is kind of this cavalier attitude to due process. It's a well-established commercial process that you do a due diligence when you're going to buy something, full stop. There are no two ways about it. And indeed, the letter from Sanogol confirmed that.
Yes.
They said they can only be on board if they were allowed. The last point I would make on this is that its timing was very awkward for ministers because it was just before an election. And I don't think that, maybe I believe in witchcraft, but I don't think that it was a coincidence that when you get close to the time when ministers anticipate that there will be a new cabinet reconstituted, and then they are under pressure to agree to something from the person who could decide their fate, I just thought that it was inappropriate.
One of the,
Okay. So did it ultimately not go ahead?
No,
this
it never went ahead.
Is this the project that you told us earlier the former president
Yes.
accused you
Yes.
and the former minister Nene to have derailed,
Former
I'm using
Minister
my
Gordon.
own words,
Former
or
Minister
Mr. Gordon,
Yeah.
to have derailed, I'm using my own words. Is this the one?
It was.
Okay.
yes. And one of the bone of contentions between the ministers, that is Minister Gordon and Minister Ben Martins at the time, was the question of a guarantee,
Yes.
which the government had to put up to back up the deal.
Yes.
I do recall from your statement that the enterprise value of that transaction was 18.67 billion.
Yes.
And the government guarantee that was required was in the order of 13 billion.
Yes. Yes. It's correct.
Do you know why government was called upon to put up a guarantee of that sort when Sonangol was going to acquire almost 49% of the shareholding?
Yes. The guarantee, the amount that for which the guarantee was requested was the equivalent of 51%, by the way, of the full transaction.
Oh, I see.
Yes. It was the equivalent. And in fact, I mean, it was interesting because, in essence, what that was saying was the commitment can only be to the extent of 51%. We wouldn't, because the application, the original request was for the full amount.
Yes.
So that the risk would have been 100% on the South African sovereign for the guarantee. And then Sanogol would have had to pick their 49% later on, which was the risk of the transaction, because they could have said, no, we don't think it's worth what you have agreed to pay for. We will get 49 for less or nothing, kind of thing. So that was the thing. The reason the guarantee was necessary is because Petro SA had, I think, now these things are risky here, they had cash of about 5 billion plus minus only, so they didn't have the balance. So, and they are small. They are small. They didn't have a balance sheet, neither the balance sheet nor the cash flows easily to convince the would-be lenders that they would be able to pay for it. So the lenders were saying, if you back your entity as the sovereign, we would look through that and be willing to lend to them, because we know that you as the sovereign would be able to pay.
But as you say, the deal did not go through. And then the next issue that you deal with, and maybe we might have to spend some time on it, relates to SAA. And Chair, I have indicated to you that SAA will be a subject matter of a presentation of detailed evidence by Ms. Hofmeyer.
Yes.
But to the extent that Ms. Fuzile wants to share with us his experience on this issue, we would have to deal with it. You start on it at page 47, paragraph 128. And in paragraph 129, you reflect on the total guarantees that government had extended to SAA by May 2017 when you left. What was the total amount of the guarantee?
It was 17.9 billion.
Are you able to tell the Chair how much of that guarantee SAA had used in accessing funds for its own capital and operational requirements?
Not off the cuff. But a substantial amount. I mean, I recall by the last count when I was still in government, they had used about 14 billion of it, between 14 and 15.
All right. And then in paragraph 130, you explain your involvement relating to applications by SAA in order to acquire additional aircraft in terms of a deal that it was negotiating at the time with, I think it is Airbus.
Yes.
Can you just give us, in summary, the structure of the deal that SAA was negotiating and how it was presented to U.S. National Treasury and what you did with that application?
There was an old contract between Airbus and SAA where SAA had sought to procure a particular type of aircrafts, I think it's the A330s. And they were now getting close to having to acquire these aircraft or to receive delivery of these aircrafts. But of course, in the way of the structures of those transactions, that there is something they call pre-delivery payments, which is understandable. Before you get your first aircraft delivered, at least you've got to pay a certain amount of money. As we were getting close to that time, there was a portion that had been paid already of these pre-delivery payments. There was now a second bit that was supposed to be paid before the first aircraft would be delivered. But at that time, SAA's cash position was in a precarious position or situation. So in negotiations with Airbus, SAA had entered into yet another deal or was on the verge of entering into yet another deal which Airbus was finding acceptable as an alternative to this original one that I've described. Where in this second deal, instead of getting those aircrafts that were part of the original transaction, SAA was going to receive a different type of aircrafts. This was favorable to SAA, or list a different type of aircraft, sorry, list a different price of. This was favorable to SAA for two reasons amongst others. First, because Airbus was saying, we will not ask you to pay the pre-delivery payments that were remaining, and in fact, we can give you back what you had already paid us. Now, for an entity that's battling with cash flow, that would have been cash positive. Second, the original transaction that SAA had entered into where they were acquiring the aircrafts, technological developments and so on had moved on such that as SAA was receiving, at the time SAA was going to receive the aircrafts, in accounting terms, and this is not my expertise, they would have had to impair a portion of the full value of the aircrafts. In other words, you're buying a car that's worth 100,000. I like 100,000, it simplifies things. But on your balance sheet, instead of reflecting that you've got an asset worth 100,000, you write that you've got only an asset worth 80,000 because it is an outdated, it's new, but in technical terms.
Yeah, sure.
So they were gonna have that, which doesn't help them because you are acquiring an expensive asset, but on your books it doesn't show as that asset.
Yeah.
So that it had those two advantages. So they were willing to list them relatively fuel efficient aircrafts, more modern and so on. And interestingly, SAA themselves had written to seek approval for this switch from the original transaction to this new one. And we had done an assessment of that at the Treasury and come to the conclusion that, as I was describing, it was going to be favorable. Then they had a change of mind, and we received correspondence, and it's attached here, I think, as LF7, where, no, not LF7, but anyway, it's attached here as one of the annexures, as LF8, I think, yeah.
Yes.
Referred to in 142. They said, no, they no longer like that transaction. They would prefer a different one now, where there is, I almost said a middleman, which was, it's no longer politically correct, but a facilitator there would be another agent or whatever entity that would lease the aircrafts from Airbus and on-lease them to SAA. And the argument for this transaction was that it would avoid the risk of foreign exchange, where, flowing out of the country first, but also just protect SAA from the foreign exchange exposure. It was not really convincing, Mr. Chairman, because the hedging that was referred to, as for instance, another party, and Mr. Maleka was referring to some of this in a different context earlier on, the other party would have faced the exchange rate risk because it's in South Africa, or it doesn't matter where it is. They would have faced the exchange rate risk, and therefore they would have had to hedge themselves, in other words, to buy insurance. And it's not inconceivable. It is inconceivable that the other party would not price in that risk, right? I mean, there's no...
They would pass it on to the customer.
Somehow. Yeah. So that the story was hardly compelling. And secondly, if value is created overseas, there is no way of getting that value into South Africa without money flowing out of South Africa, except if you receive it as a gift. But someone must pay, and that has got a balance of payments impact. So I'm saying the second structure didn't make sense at all. The respective ministers, first Mr. Nene...
Was it the second or the third? The third
Yes.
type of transaction?
Yes,
or
the third
structure?
type of transaction,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. The second one was favorable.
The second one
third
was favorable, acceptable.
Yeah, and
The third one was
problematic.
unacceptable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And bearing in mind, Mr. Chairman, which is a very important point that SAA seemed not to appreciate. One, the time was not on their side. I think it was the 21st of December by which the contract had to be signed, right? But at the same time, Airbus had something to fall back onto, which is the original contract, which was valid.
Yes, it had not been cancelled.
It had not been cancelled.
As all of this was being done,
At
it
any-
was being done on the assumption that if there was agreement, then the original would be cancelled. But obviously, if there was no agreement on the subsequent ones, the old one would stand.
So whenever Airbus would find the new arrangement unacceptable, they just had the option of insisting that in that case, let's invoke the original contract, which was valid. So what then I found very strange about this, and I refer to this in the statement, is the fact that when we then met, and I'm not trying to boast that I was working on a holiday, but on the 16th of December, we met with the acting CEO, trying to find this, but I remember it from the top of my head, and the acting CFO, Mr. Musa Zwane and Ms. Pumeza Nancy, respectively, to look at these two transactions. And we explained to them why we were not convinced that what they wanted to switch to was acceptable. This is in 147, on page 53,
Right.
Mr. Chairman. We explained to them, and ultimately, not even with any difficulty, they accepted that the second transaction was logical and was favorable to the airline. So we said to them, then go and implement it. The minister has approved it. And they said, no, but it's going to be hard for us. Can you go and convince our chairman like you have done to us? And I said to them, look, I'm not supposed to be here in the first place. Just for context, I had only stayed behind because Minister Nene had been fired. If you remember, I had 3 ministers over a few days. So I had to stick around to just...
if there were issues.
If there were issues, yes. So my leave was supposed to commence on the 13th, but I happened to be there. So on the 16th, which is why I said to them, let's meet on that 16th, so that afterwards I left then Mr. Ishmael Momonia to act. Needless to say, ultimately Minister Gordon only approved the the second
The
transaction.
second transaction.
After having received a call from the president and stuff, and he has testified in that regard here.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. The one footnote which was conversed by Ms. Makanda when she gave evidence related to a newspaper inquiry about what the firing of Minister Nene would mean to the request for approval which was pending at that point in time. And Chair, I think you heard her evidence that she had to raise that issue with the Chief of Staff of Minister Van Rooyen, and it was dealt with on the basis of his suggestion. You conclude that part of SAA by referring to the resignation of one of the board members, and you refer to her details on page 54, paragraph 151. Right. Do you want to sum up
Yes.
your version on that issue?
Yes. I mean, I'm saying there on 151, I make the point that it was around that time that apparently because of dissatisfaction with the fact that what the board wanted had been rejected by the two ministers, because it was first rejected by Mr. Nene. Mr. Van Rooyen didn't have time to consider it, and then it was then again rejected by Mr. Gordon, instead approved what the board had asked for as the second transaction. She then tendered her resignation, and you can see in her letter, which is annexed here as LF9, she does make some reference to her dissatisfaction.
Yes, it's on page 167. And then you draw some conclusion also by referring to the appointment of a new board for SAA. Again, Minister Godin testified about this. I wonder whether you have any additional issues to raise concerning the appointment of new board members.
Probably three very quick points on it, and I promise they will be quick. The first one is just, it was difficult for me as an official to understand how an important entity like SAA could be made to continue with what I could call a skeleton board, essentially. There were three people for an extended period of time. Ms. Mieni, Dr. Tambi, and Ms. Yake Quinan, because at one stage along the way, Mr. Dixon in November 2015 had resigned. So essentially we had three people.
The board had consisted of 5 people?
At one stage it was 4.
Oh, okay.
Ms. Mieni, Ms. Yake Quinan, Dr. Tambi, and Mr. Anthony Dixon.
Yeah, but what I mean is when it had a full complement, or is that something you don't know?
On Wi-Fi, no, it's about 10 or 12 people.
Oh,
It's supposed to be a big board, but other members had resigned along the way.
to the point where only about 3 were,
To the point where only about 3 were remaining.
and were they quarried? You don't know.
I mean, it's difficult to tell. I mean, there were only there were 3 non-executives, but as you remember, the CEO and the CFO would be executive members of the board.
Yeah.
So we were concerned about this, and so were the lenders. And I know this because I had to personally speak to all of the CEOs of the banks, requesting them to continue to support SAA because we were dealing with the board appointment issue. But one makes the point on this, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Malaka, just to make the point that it was so difficult, and there was the insistence, and one might say these things perhaps in less diplomatic ways in the interest of time now, but there were so many attempts to try and appoint the board, but it became apparent, as Mr. Gordon testified here, that whilst the lenders were of the view, and I think they had good reasons to hold that view, that government needed to sweep clean and remove everyone who was on the board because they had lost confidence in them. They doubted their credibility for their own reasons, good or bad. And they had given SAA money. SAA needed their money. It was just hard to understand this insistence on keeping Ms. Mieni as part of the board. Otherwise, there would be no board. But ultimately, as I indicate in the submission, once Mr. Gordon had accepted that the removal of Ms. Mieni was not going to happen, the process for appointing or helping with choosing the other members of the board was left to a process that Ms. Lakela Kaunda and I ran, and I kept Mr. Mukhajane close by just so that I'm not on my own at any time. And so we had a few meetings, and ultimately a board was appointed, still chaired by Ms. Mieni.
Are you able to give an estimate of, to your recollection, for how long it was that this SA board consisted of 3 or 4 members or so? If you are able to, in a year or more than that or something?
In 162, we indicate that the board was ultimately appointed on the 2nd of September.
Yes. But the key point to start with on the date sequence
Yes.
is 153, when Mr. Dixon resigned.
Yes.
And that was in November 2015.
In November 2015. So from that time, the board, it's almost a year actually, to just simplify it, because by 20 years, because from October 2014, as 152 indicates, the board only had 4 non-executives. And then that status continued until the 2nd of September, as indicated under 162, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so almost a year.
Almost a year.
Yeah, okay.
And the difficulty, as I say in 163, was just that, you know, the people who were lending money to SAA felt that working with that board was not ideal. In fact, some of them, they didn't mince their words. At least 2 of them called me and said, you know, how do you expect us to continue to do business with this entity? And I mean, if truth be told, SAA has had enormous difficulty raising money, which is why government so far, I think, has injected about 15 billion of taxpayers' money into SAA. Because lenders, I mean, I know some people don't like this, but when you depend on people to run a business, you can't ignore their views.
I'm sure Minister Tito Mboweni will have something to say in the course of his budget presentation tomorrow or so on SAA. But Chair, the details on these issues will be given to you in full.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
And the third last remaining topic is the Sociograms Question. And it's a matter that has been publicized time without number, because it has gone up and down, in and out of various courts. And the chairperson will be aware of various judgments of the Constitutional Court on this matter. You discuss it from page 57, paragraph 164. Can you pick up the highlights, again, without repeating what we have already heard? And I hope I'm not constraining you unduly.
No, not at all. No, I'm very happy with that approach, Mr. Malek. You will let me know when I'm not being helpful to the Commission. The main issue that I raise in my case here, Mr. Chairman, which I think adds value to the work of the Commission, relates to the fact that I received a letter, and the specifics of it are contained here, and that letter is attached, I think, as LF10.
Yes. Page
What page is that?
168, Chair.
Thank you.
I received this letter, and this letter was no, leave that interference one. The one that I'm looking for is the one applying for the extension of the contract, sorry.
All right, that will be on page 172.
Yes, thank you for that, Mr. Wala.
What page again?
172.
Thank you very much for that.
Onwards.
Thank you very much for that help. Now, and I think this is the nub of my introduction of this issue to this commission, which is the fact that I received this letter requesting that we should allow SASSA to deviate from inviting competitive bids and instead have them continue with the CPS contract.
That's cash pay master services.
Yes, cash pay master services, Mr. Chairman. Now, I found that problematic because that contract had been found, as the chairman would know, to be invalid, I think is the phrase that's used. And the invalidity had been suspended until the 1st of April, 2017. So, in a way, I said to the applicant, but how would I get around this reality of the finding?
Yes.
And of course, there are other contextual issues where an impression had been created that a new alternative would be in place around that time. And the right thing to do would have been, upon realizing that the alternative was not going to be able to be switched on the 1st of April, to go back to the Court and say, look, there is this invalidity, you've suspended it, can you suspend it again? I mean, so people were not giving us any convincing argument of the place where Treasury, me in particular, because the application was addressed to me, I would derive the authority to override what the Court had decided. I find this to be very awkward, actually. Needless to point out that at a date that I don't quite remember, but end February or March, I think it was in March, Mr. Chairman, in March 2017, there was a discussion in Cabinet on this matter. My interpretation of it was that, I mean, I couldn't understand why the matter was there, with me there, with the question of why not provide for this deviation. You know, and one puts it because there was a risk at a moment like that, that one could have succumbed to that pressure, in which case that would have placed me in a position where all of a sudden now I'm the one who cited in the papers, Court and other places, because I've exercised authority I didn't have. So one raises this with a bit of a heavy heart. But again, in the context of wanting to help South Africa and South Africans understand some of the difficulties we had to deal with during this period, some of which might repeat themselves in future, by the way.
Yes.
Because I just felt that I couldn't understand for the life of me that
how it could
anyone could ask any person to do something along these lines. thankfully, one could stand one's ground, and we had support from the entire department, and so on. So it's that's the most useful, I think, lesson from this.
Yes.
In other words, the problem of SASSA would have become my problem. Had I granted this deviation. And I was not going to allow that to happen.
No, I think you did well to raise the issue, Mr. Fuzile.
Okay.
It's quite important.
Yes. I mean, really the rest of the issue on SASSA request for deviation was dealt with by Minister Gordon. And Chair, you remember he referred you to, I think it was Annex 30 to his affidavit, which was his confidential response to the President when he was asked to deal with that question. After Minister Dlamini had made a representation to the President. I think the issue has been well covered.
Well, I might not have as good a memory as you, but if you say it was covered, I'll take that.
Yes.
I'll accept that.
I have an annex here which is confidential,
Yes.
which was
Okay.
part of his statement.
Okay.
And I do recall that the issue was raised with.
No, that's fine. That's
Yeah.
fine.
All right. The next issue is the closure of the Gupta bank accounts. You deal with that issue from page 61.
Yes.
And once again, we had the evidence of the bank CEOs who were led by my colleague Mukwena and others of his colleagues. I think all the major banks testified on this issue to explain why they closed the bank accounts. We also had the evidence of Minister Gordon about his application to court. Is there any issue that you want the chairperson to consider from your perspective regarding that topic?
Just again, 2 points. It looks like there's magic with two now here. The first one is that, I bore witness to the conversation
Yes.
between Minister Gordon and Mr. Howe.
Yes.
Howard.
Yes.
And Ms. Ronika Raghavan. When they, asked for a meeting, we contemplated whether to meet them. Ultimately, the meeting took place, and the contents of the meeting are captured in Minister Gordon's letter. The matter was later ventilated in courts, stuff like that. But it just corroborates the fact that there was this pressure brought to bear on Minister Gordon somehow to intervene in the relationship between banks and the client, which, as I in the statement do refer to some of the comments that I even made during the discussion with Mr. Howard, to say that, but the only best place for them to go to was the court. And if they think that the banks are behaving waywardly or inconsistently with the law, courts exist for that purpose. And if they think that the law is written badly and it gives too much power to banks, there again, courts would be the best place. I even emphasized to him that we want that. We want case law to help us either reinforce the correctness of the law and the processes followed, or to show them to have flaws and stuff like that. That's the first point.
Yes. And
But sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
The meeting concerned took place on the 24th of May,
Yes.
2016,
Yes, as
at
referred
the
to in
Office of National Treasury.
Yes.
You were present at that meeting,
Yes.
and you had some few remarks to make.
Yes.
And can you go to page 63, paragraph 88,
Yes.
188?
Yes.
You draw some strands from the concluding remarks you made at that meeting.
Yes. I hope I'm going to where you want me to go to 188. I mean, one of the points that I pointed out, by the way, to Mr. Hall was that the attacks that there had been on the integrity of the Treasury by some people, including him actually, were not helpful and they were not in the national interest, and if they could, they should avoid them. There was a presentation that was doing rounds. I looked for it and I gave up finding it, but it had his name and he didn't deny that he had made the presentation to people at the headquarters of the ANC. But the presentation was purporting a connection between people who had been at the Treasury before and some who remained, and white monopoly capital and all that kind of those kinds of epithets. And I said to him, those kinds of stuff are not helpful. And of course, I do refer there that in his own presentation, there was reference to a document that had surfaced around August I will remember at some point, but this reference to Carol Petty, but there was this spider web document on which, that's referred to in 188. Operation Spider Web was a kind of a document that was anonymous, which found its way into the email system of certain officials at the Treasury. And it was almost like an intelligence report of sorts itself, but it also was making very, very bad actually, pathetic comments about people at the Treasury being former apartheid spies, about us being connected to or being part of a broader kind of conspiratorial project of Stellenbosch and stuff like that, and that we were controlled, which I find insulting, by people or outside interests. I mean, this is despite the fact that many of us, and I mean, I'm not just referring to myself here, many of us have got academic qualifications from some of the best institutions in South Africa and the rest of the world. For people to think that when we make recommendations on policy, it is because we're being controlled by people other than our own ability to think, I find it to be very insulting.
Well, if you don't know, in the world of intelligence, it's called active measures.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But
I commend a book by a man called Malcolm Nance. The title is The Plot to Destroy Democracy. You'll see how active measures of this kind operate in the world of intelligence.
Yeah, except that some of the inferences and the way they are made here, it would be silly to call that stuff intelligence.
Well, if you read that book, you'll be less affronted.
I just, look, we can debate it, but the stuff that I'm talking about in this Operation Spider Web, if you see it.
Yes.
But anyway, he was saying that what was happening between the banks and their businesses and our insistence that the only route they had were the courts was serving to confirm what was in that spider web thing. In other words, that we were captured, that we were serving other interests. I mean, in all fairness, I'm sure time will tell, but they had a lot to explain in terms of stuff.
Yes.
We didn't need to come.
You summarize the spiderweb operation by referring to...
Before you proceed, can I confirm that you have actually covered the two original points that you had said you needed to
I think so.
make?
I think so.
I just don't want
the second point that I had wanted to cover, by the way, which is, I refer to it in a by the way type of way in 186, which is that we had two pieces of legislation that got stuck in the system around the time of this closure of Gupta accounts process. One of them was the Financial Intelligence Amendment Bill, which was seeking to amend the Financial Intelligence Act and give more teeth and strengthen the anti-money laundering and all those kinds of provisions, and the Financial Sector Regulation Bill. One mentions this because for some very peculiar reason, these pieces of law encountered serious problems going through the processes of making law in South Africa, including going up to a point where they would reach the president's desk and then get sent back, right? And what I take from that is that, and a colleague was even reminding me that I made this point, which I mean, I didn't recall, but until he reminded me, I didn't remember until he reminded me, which was that I was amazed at how people inside government would make the arguments that I used to see on ANN7. I mean, honestly, against these two pieces of law. And I was shocked that people who were tasked with making the law in the interest of the country would be informed by the considerations around the stuff as to how to frame the law. If you, I mean, I can explain why I mean, but I found that very, very, very disturbing.
Well, maybe for the sake of completeness, you need to say why you found it strange that people, I think you said within cabinet, used arguments that you used to hear from a certain TV channel. It looks like to me there's a context which you need to, for anybody reading your evidence to understand where you're coming from.
Essentially, Mr. Chairman, in a modern world, our financial system is an integral part of the international financial system. I needn't explain that if you were to have to travel overseas now, all you would do is to just pack your bags and go to the airport. When you land on the other side, you transact. Perhaps you never asked why is that possible. It is possible because the international financial system is intertwined, it's interconnected.
Seamless.
And for that reason, the regulation thereof has got to move in tandem to some degree globally, because the system is as strong as the weakest part of it. I don't know if I'm making sense. If part of what the world is grappling with is fighting money laundering, illicit flows, you name all of those things, there can't be a part of the world that says we won't do it, but we want to be part of that international financial system. Because in essence, that part of the world would conceivably undermine the efforts and the investments of the entire world. So then the laws, if I may just finish this point, the laws were being crafted not with the Guptas in mind. The laws were being crafted with the interests of South Africa, the rest of the population, the rest of the businesses of South Africa. All of them, not just the financial services sector. Because the financial services sector exists to serve in the main these other businesses. So the laws were being crafted to make sure that we strengthen the regulation of the South African financial system to be in line with the rest of the world. The fact that these laws were beginning to cause some inconvenience for certain people because of the way they were conducting their businesses was incidental.
Okay. You may proceed, Mr.
Thank you, Chair.
Malek.
Yes, Mr. Fuzile, you can take comfort from the fact that Mr. Sinton spoke a lot about the reason why the FICA Act had to be amended. And we know it has been, and ultimately the President signed. And we know that the Financial Sector Regulation Act has been passed, and the Twin Peaks model is now in operation. So those issues were canvassed in detail, and I wonder whether there's anything that's left for you to say in relation to the closure of the bank accounts.
No, nothing whatsoever.
Then we go to the second last issue, which is the Denel VR laser deal on page 65. And again, I have to say to the chairperson that this issue is going to be canvassed in detail by my colleague, Ms. Kabashe, who's busy with Denel. But just give us the highlights of your contribution on that deal, because you were part and parcel of the affidavit that was signed by National Treasury to oppose the application for Denel for a declaratory order that it has procured the relevant permission in terms of Section 54 of the PFMA.
Yes, I mean, it's been covered in quite detail by, I think, Mr. Gordon did that, and you are right, it will come back later on. But the one point I just wanted to add on this was that I was astounded by the determination of the people involved to just proceed with a transaction without the requisite approvals. And in the words of Minister Gordon, their belligerence, which was reflected, as I remember in my case, in the fact that they could issue even a very terse statement which was attacking him personally and the Treasury as a department or institution in response to a letter that never existed. But what was even more striking about this was the fact that for a very long time, and I take this to be a reflection of the fragility of our system at the time, most of the people, when I say most, I mean perhaps an overgeneralization, but people in government for whom things like this ought to have mattered, they didn't seem to matter. It was left to be the Treasury stroke Minister Gordon's problem with Denel. Whereas what we have at risk were the following two things. One was the risk that the intellectual property, which was born out of investments made out of South African taxpayers' money, were going to be externalized or exported just easily like that. Secondly, it was the fact that, in fact, Denel had been propped up by government through guarantees to the tune of about 1.8 billion, and therefore needed to be using or commercializing its intellectual property in a manner that would have enabled it to raise the money to service the debt, to reduce the risk that those guarantees would be called. And there they were willing to externalize very easily at excessively generous prices or contractual arrangements, and doing so, by the way, without the requisite approvals.
As a matter of interest, do you know what happened to that litigation after you filed your opposing affidavit?
Yes, I'm told that Denel withdrew. They pulled back.
Okay. And do you know the context why Denel, which initiated the application, suddenly went a change of heart and withdrew the application?
No, the honest truth is that I don't know, because I don't know if the change on the board and stuff preceded that. I don't know. I didn't check that part.
Ms. Kabashi will deal with it. Finally, your reflective conclusions about your resignation as the DG of Treasury. And those are the painful, reflective remarks you make. And I would not be presumptuous. I'd like you to deal with them in your own words, beginning from paragraph 205.
Essentially, what had happened was that we sought the requisite approvals, in my case from Minister Gordon, to travel overseas as the rules require. In his case and in Mr. Jonas's case from the President, because when members of the executive, ministers or deputy ministers are to travel abroad, they've got to seek such approval. We obtained it. They obtained it. That's my understanding. In my case, I know as a matter of fact that I had received the approval. The idea was to go overseas so that we can meet investors, we can meet rating agencies, with the sole purpose, and I emphasize the sole purpose of just telling them about economic policy developments in South Africa, and to the extent that they would be interested, political developments. And it's a routine thing. We do this minimum twice a year, after every budget or medium-term budget policy statement. And the idea of it is to make sure that the people who buy South African government bonds are fully aware, and they hear it from the people close to the processes of making policy and developing budgets, are aware of the direction of the South African government on those matters. Of course, upon landing in London, we were told that the approval to be on the roadshow had been rescinded, and we should return forthwith. Of course, it's I think Mr. Gordon had explained, we had to confide in each other and decide on the spot whether we sit on our hands in London for the whole day, having incurred the cost to go there, having people ready to meet us, or we would meet them. We decided on the latter. We decided that we should meet the people, we should talk to the rating agencies, all three of them. We met 2 face-to-face as scheduled on the day, and only 1 over the phone. And we continued with the meetings on the day, and then flew back to South Africa. And upon arrival here, because I was using his car, we ended up at Lutuli House. He has reported or testified on the conversation between him and Mr. Mantashe, which I sat in, but it was their conversation. And it was clear from that meeting that he and Mr. Jonas were going to be removed from the positions of Minister of Finance and Deputy Finance Minister respectively. And of course, I had kind of made up my mind in my case from the time that we were called back, that I actually think that my time for serving as the Director General was up. So I tendered my resignation on the 29th. We discussed it on the 28th. I said, because I mean, out of respect, I just didn't want to shove it under their noses. I told them about my thoughts and how I was reasoning the process. So I did tender my resignation on the 29th. Of course, I decided that just to make sure that the process was orderly, I would give 6 weeks notice, ending on the 15th of May. That's the last line, I think, or second last line in my submission. So it was on that note that I reached the end of the runway in respect to working for government.
What made you resign? What made you come to the conclusion that you have reached the end of the runway in public service?
Look, I felt that there was no chance of making a positive difference.
What would you have done had you not been recalled from the London, New York trips?
Can't quite tell, but I would have continued with the roadshow and returned to come back and do my work until May 2018, which was the time that my contract was supposed to expire. But of course, I had made up my mind. Let me just state this categorically, that after all the changes that I had encountered of ministers, not because of any loyalty to Minister Gordon, but I had just decided that he was going to be the last minister I would serve under. I mean, on the occasion of tabling the budget, one journalist who asked the question what the changes were doing to morale and just people, frequent changes of ministers, so to speak. And I mean, one made the point that it takes a lot to learn to work with each politician because each one of them have got their own styles. When they change frequently, it is very hard to keep focus on the work. And of course, it gets worse when they change and you keep wondering in your mind, what are the reasons for the change? And you can't find any rational reason for such changes. You start to wonder if you are a Director General, at least in my case I did, about whether, in fact, part of what was playing out was the fact that the ministers would come and we just work well together. And we continue on the same course. And then people say, oh, okay, even this one does not do what we want. And then the next one. I mean, I'm human. I mean, so that thought did cross my mind. And I came actually to the conclusion that some of the changes could never be meant to strengthen the Treasury. They were meant to weaken it. And I feared that having been part of building it for 18, 19 years, I couldn't also be part of seeing it getting weak. I would rather watch it from outside, even if with a sore heart.
Chair, I have reached the end of the runway regarding my questions to Mr. Fuzile.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Fuzile, for coming back again to assist us. It may be that you might be asked again. I just hope that your employers will, after my remarks today, will be more understanding. But thank you very much for having come to give evidence again. And but if you have got something to say, please feel free.
Chairman, I don't want to leave the Commission with the impression that my employer is not keen to help. In fact, if anything, they do want to help. But it's important for me, definitely, but also for my employer, that I suspect that, I mean, some of these dates, I think it would assist a lot if we can just talk about them in advance.
Yeah.
Because,
yeah.
I mean, let me illustrate it this way.
Yes.
They are very, very important. This is very important.
Yes.
It's
yes.
exceedingly important for the country. I must first preface what I'm going to say by saying that.
Yes.
But there are also other important things. So there is a sense in which a person in a position like me, if, for instance, on a day that the board is scheduled to meet, and the Commission says to me, I must come here, it doesn't matter what, it's not helping my career. Right?
No, I understand, yes.
And it is not out of lack of appreciation of the importance, the urgency, and all that kind of stuff. It gets a bit worse, and I understand the balances that you are dealing with.
Yes.
But then it gets worse. Someone says they want to cross-examine me. I say, look, the 19th and 18th, and I might not be convenient, or 19th and 20th, I can't remember the dates now.
Yes.
I've gone blank. People insist, no, come. And then I come, and then I get told, no,
Yes.
the person is not ready.
Yes.
I mean, I've changed things, cancelled things to be here.
Yes.
So, and I know if you were to schedule and be accommodating to everyone, you would never do your job. But similarly,
yes, but you
it's
you
just
just
a balancing
yes.
act, yes.
No,
So
it's
I don't
a
want to
legit.
leave the commission
Yes.
with the wrong impression.
No,
My
thank
employer is very happy to release me to come here.
Yes.
But
The manner in which
they want to make sure that I make a fair contribution for
to
what
them
I'm
as
paid.
well. Yeah. No, I understand, Mr. Fuzile. Those concerns will be taken into account. Obviously, from your own remarks, I can tell that you were paying attention this morning when I talked about, the balancing act, we have been trying to do that, and as you point out, it will be difficult to always make everybody happy, but we will not disregard concerns. We'll take them into account and do the best that we can, having regard to all the interests, the balancing act that we must do. So I'll say that the legal team will have heard what you have said. You have heard what my attitude is, and we will be trying our best, but it might not be with you, but there may come a time where one just has no other way but to make certain decisions so that things can go ahead. But thank you very much, and we appreciate that you came and you were allowed to come. Thank you very much. You are excused. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Chair, the last witness who we propose to call tomorrow
Yes.
is Ms. Catherine McLeod.
Yes. How long is she likely to be? Are you able to tell me?
Were I to lead the evidence, I would take about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. But Mr. Mukwena might well want to do
Might
that.
take only 30 minutes.
I don't know. I'll ask him.
Yeah. Okay, all right. But by all accounts, she's unlikely to need the whole day.
Yes, no, I don't think she'll need the whole day.
Yeah.
And we may usefully make use of what remains of tomorrow's time to deal with outstanding issues
Yes.
relating to the program going forward.
Yes. I
mean, I say so in the light of the promise by the lawyers of Mr. Van Rooyen to give us his affidavit by this afternoon.
Yes.
And if the affidavit meets your expectation, then you'll decide on the question of cross-examination, and then we can make logistical arrangements on when that should take place.
I guess that the best one can say is as soon as the affidavit is in, the next thing will be for all concerned to apply their mind to it and say whether they will need to file anything in response.
Yes.
And once we know all of that, then one can take it from there.
Yes.
But if we finish early tomorrow, as it looks like we would with regard to Treasury witnesses, would there be room to begin with Eskom in regard to that proportion of Eskom that might not entail witnesses as yet?
Yes. We have set it down for Wednesday, Chair, because there's lots of documentation.
Okay. So we should rather keep it for Wednesday.
Yes. And
okay.
we would like to make submissions on the suggested way of dealing with Eskom's evidence, because as you know, there have been lots of inquiries. And in fairness, we don't want to repeat what has
Yes.
taken place in those inquiries.
Yeah.
We simply want to focus on areas where the previous inquiries left the gaps for you to fill,
Yes.
rather than to rerun.
Yeah.
And we would like to present to you evidence which has been heard by the previous bodies that conducted inquiries, to show to you that that evidence was elicited publicly. It remains largely undisputed, and it calls for explanation by those who are implicated.
Yeah.
So there will be lots of documentation
Yeah.
before you.
Okay, so no, that's fine. I just wanted to see whether there might be, whether we would adjourn for the day after the next week Treasury witness, or whether we might continue. But from what you are saying, it looks like we certainly won't commence with anything connected with Eskom until Wednesday.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, all right. We are going to adjourn then until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We adjourn.
All right.